I'm going to be talking about some research that doesn't save people's lives, but it is still very cool. I'm not really going to focus on my particular research or any particular project, but rather give a kind of a general overview of this field that I think is really exciting, and there's some really interesting discoveries going to come out recently. So I'm interested in hybridization and what consequences hybridization has for evolution of our species and for other species. So first, so I'm going to kind of focus on three questions. Firstly, just what is a hybrid? What do I mean when I talk about hybridization? And to discuss that, I really have to look at what seems like quite a simple question: what is a species? And then, how do we study hybridization? So, what would my research generally involve? And then, what the kind of interesting part is, what does this mean for us and for evolution of other species? So, what is a hybrid? I think we all have some general idea of what the word hybrid means. It's a mix. It's an intermediate. It's when two things that don't usually mate come together and produce something that is a mixture of genes. One thing I want to contest that I think is a common misconception is that hybridization is an unnatural process, that hybrids are mistakes. We use words like half-breed as a very derogatory term. But I want to make the point that sometimes hybrids are unnatural. For example, tigers and lions don't live in the same area, so they're very unlikely to hybridize. But hybridization is not always unnatural, and it's quite possible that these species did hybridize in the past, and their ranges did overlap. And it might be unnatural now that they don't overlap because we may have driven lions out of the regions where tigers now live. Anyway, I'll get to that point in a little bit. But if hybridization is not unnatural, then it could have real consequences in the evolution of all species, not just in cases where it is forced by humans. So, as I said, we're going to quickly look at the question of what is a species. It seems like a fairly simple question. Species are things that look different from one another, but look the same as each other, if that makes sense. There are, of course, problems with just describing species based on how they look. We've known this for a long time. Classic example is something like dogs, where there's huge variation in size and shape and behavior. And you could argue that this is very unnatural as well, because humans kind of bred them to look like this. But we do see great variation in species across the natural world as well. One of my favorite examples are these butterflies in the bottom right there. This is a species of swallowtail from Africa. It was originally described as about 13 different species, just so many different color pattern forms. And it wasn't until people started doing breeding experiments that they found that these were all one species. And this figure is great because those three shown are not only from the same species, but they're actually siblings. So these two on the top are sisters, and this is their brother down there. So it shows what tremendous differences you can get even in a family. And I guess just by looking around the room, you can see that describing a species based on how they look is quite, it's a flawed concept. So people have said, well, what about breeding, intermating? That should be a good definition. Species are things that mate with one another, but don't mate with other species. And that usually holds up, but it doesn't always hold up. In fact, that's what my talk is about, the fact that sometimes species interbreed. And if we define species based on whether they can breed with each other, then we'd be lumping lots of things together that really should be considered separately, such as horses and donkeys. Horses and zebras that can breed together to make a zorse. So, so the criterion of mating is also kind of imperfect. So a final way that people have been thinking about what is a species, and I think it's probably the best way, is to not ask what they look like or what they do, but rather to ask where they come from in terms of their evolution. I think you're all familiar with the concept of a tree of life, so all species are related, and they share common ancestors at some point in the past, but all individuals from one species come from one branch of this tree. And so you can get a nice clear definition of what a species is. The problem is that if, say, these two species in the middle could interbreed and could make a hybrid, and if that hybrid was fertile, which is often the case, then that hybrid would be able to breed with either one of these species, and it would then pass on genes when it mated with one of these species to its offspring, and so it would be transferring genes from this blue population into the turquoise population. And so what you end up getting is a species that is a mixture of genes that come from different branches on the tree of life. So no longer do we have a tree that keeps branching, but we have a tree that sometimes merges again. And yeah, it does complicate the definition of what is a species, but I think it's a very exciting process that people haven't really considered. Is what does it matter? What does it mean when genes come from somewhere else on the tree into a different species? And that's the process that I have been studying. So how do we actually study this? Well, in the past, the best thing you could do is just examine animals in nature and see what they do and who they mate with. And there's a very famous example of this type of work. These birds on the right here are called Darwin's finches. There are about 15 species. And two of these species, one has a slightly longer beak and eats cactus leaves, and one has a shorter beak and eats seeds. Live on this island called Daphne Major in the Galapagos. And two researchers, Peter and Rosemary Grant, very well known for having spent pretty much their whole lives going out to this island where there isn't much to do, as you can see, and spending all their time capturing birds, weighing them and measuring them, and tracking how these species have behaved and have changed over time. And they really committed their entire lives to understanding these species. Every summer they would go out and they would catch every single individual of these two species on that island. And by doing that, they could keep track of who's mating with who, and are these species really keeping apart from one another. And what they found is that now and then you find individuals that to us look very much like either of these, but according to their very precise measurements, they could tell that some of these individuals were intermediate between the two species. And later, when they could sequence DNA from the two species, they could show that this individual is a mixture of genes from both. So decades and decades of work, and we know about kind of one case, which isn't very satisfying. Fortunately, now we can do things a lot more simply by sequencing the genomes of species, so sequencing all their DNA and asking if there's evidence of genes coming from different parts of the tree. We don't have to go out and watch them for months on end, although that could be fun, I guess, for a few months. So, yeah, so we can take a bunch of things that fit on different parts of the tree and sequence the DNA. And what we're looking for then is a bit of DNA that looks like it's come from elsewhere on the tree. So if we had some genes in this turquoise species that actually come from this blue branch, then by looking at the DNA sequence, we should be able to find bits of the genome that look like they come from a different branch of the tree. Obviously, DNA isn't simple and colorful like this. It's just a bunch of codes, letters, molecules, millions and billions of bases long. The human genome is 3 billion bases long, so it's a huge sort of bank of data that you have to search through to find these sequences. And one of the things we do is write computer programs that use this tree as a kind of a model and try to infer how much kind of exchange of genes has happened based on how similar or how different the DNA sequences of different species are. And one of the most studied groups in this regard is actually humans. So obviously the human genome has been sequenced and studied now for the last 15 years, and we can now study human genomes from people all across the world. And we know that humans from Europe are slightly more closely related than those from Africa, and we can even think of them as existing on a tree like this, even though we know that these branches aren't completely separate from one another. We know that for some time before there was world travel, these branches did kind of stay quite separate from one another. But the humans that exist today are not the only human-like people that have ever lived, we know that. And we know that we coexisted for some time with some human-like organisms that are now extinct. We have Neanderthals, from which we have many bones. They have larger heads, generally larger bodies, this very big brow, and they lived in Europe around the time that the first European humans left Africa. And then we have another group of things that we don't actually know what they look like. The only bones we have are a few teeth, and there's also a bone from the pinky finger of one individual. But we've been able to sequence DNA from those bones, and we know just by the similarity of DNA that it was a close relative of the Neanderthals that lived in Asia around the same time. And so a very obvious question is, if these types of humans and these types of humans lived in Europe at the same time, did they interbreed? And loads and loads of amazing research has been done by people from all over the world, and it's shown quite convincingly now that there was interbreeding at least twice. Once between Neanderthals and humans that were on their way out of Africa. So this kind of group of humans that eventually led to Asians and Europeans. And then again, after that, after the Asians moved into Asia, they apparently met with the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and there was some more interbreeding there. So this is kind of really exciting that this process of interbreeding and exchange of genes even happens in our own tree. Another example that I guess has received a lot of attention because they're big, furry, nice-looking animals. Polar bears and brown bears. Polar bears all live close to the pole, and brown bears all live on the mainlands of all the northern hemisphere continents. But they do meet sometimes where their ranges kind of overlap. So an obvious question is, do polar bears and brown bears ever share genes? And there was actually a paper on this that came out just last week that confirmed that here in Alaska, there has been interbreeding between polar bears and brown bears. And that Alaskan polar bear genome is actually about 8%, sorry, the Alaskan brown bear genome is actually about 8% polar bear. Even though they completely look like brown bears, they carry genes from polar bears. So what does it mean? What's the point of all this? Does this exchange of genes actually have any effect on the evolution of species? Well, there are a few ways it can. The one way that people have spoken about for a very long time, and some people are quite worried about, is this idea of species collapse. There's a very good example of this in Darwin's finches. This is another pair of finches from a different island. There used to be 2 species on the island about 100 years ago. For some reason, they started to interbreed more and more. And now, sadly, there's actually only 1 species left on this island. And it's not thought that those other species went extinct. It's thought that the species, the large bee, interbred so much with the other species, and because these were rare, their genes just kind of got diluted. And now there are no individuals that look like that because they've been swamped out by the genes from these other species. So it's a bit like if you were painting 2 different jars of paint and you kept filling your paintbrush into both, but one jar had a whole lot more paint than the other, then the paints would start to mix. But eventually they would probably both end up just looking like the jar with the most paint in it, because that larger jar just kind of dilutes the other paint out completely. So this is something that's quite sad. We don't really want to see species disappearing. But it's also a process that could happen naturally. So what we worry about is if this hybridization started because of something that humans did. In this case, they're not sure, but they think it might be related to climate change. Just to show you an example of the sorts of things we do, we work with computer programs sometimes, so I wrote a very simple computer program just to simulate what this would look like. In this case, we have 2 species that have the same number of individuals of both. And if they started to interbreed, after 1 generation, we would get, we all carry 2 chromosomes, one from our mother, one from our father. So after 1 generation, there would be some individuals that still have 2 blue or 2 red chromosomes. And some individuals would be heterozygous, so they have a blue and a red chromosome from each species. And after a few more generations, because of recombination, the exchange of chromosomes when we make our gametes, we would get chromosomes that have bits of blue and bits of red. And after 100 generations, so maybe 100 years in a species that has a generation a year, we would get really mixed up chromosomes. And we no longer have two species here, we just have one species that is a remnant of two branches that used to be separate from the tree. A second process is kind of the opposite of species collapse. It's called hybrid speciation. And the idea here is that hybridization can actually create a new species that didn't exist before. And a famous case of this comes out of the Heliconius butterflies. These are actually the species that I study in my work. In this case, these three species have always been known to exist in South America, they live in Colombia, but researchers, just by looking at them, proposed that perhaps this third species was not always there. It wasn't its own branch in the tree of life, but rather it came out of hybridization between these other species. And by sequencing the genomes of these three species, they could show that this species did arise from a mixing of genes from the first two species. But the interesting thing in this case is that the first two species still exist. So for some reason, the kind of the jars of paint didn't get mixed up. And they think that one of the main factors here that led to three species staying separate is that this middle species doesn't like to mate with either of its parent species. The red species prefers to mate with red individuals, but sometimes makes a mistake. The white species prefers to mate with white individuals, but also sometimes makes a mistake. And the red and white species prefers, because it has a mixture of red and white genes, it prefers to mate with individuals that have both red and white. So it tends to mate with other hybrids rather than mating with one or the other species. And they think that's what keeps these three separate. It may also be natural selection keeping them separate. So maybe it's beneficial for each of these species to mate with their own kind rather than the other kind. I just added this picture here of Chris Jiggins. Professor Chris Jiggins is also a member of St. John's College, and he's the person who actually supervised all of this work. This was done just before I started my PhD. And I've also worked very closely with him for a few years. He's not here today. He would usually be, but today he's out catching butterflies in Panama and doing other biologist type things out there. So final, probably the most exciting thing that hybridization can do is called adaptive introgression. Adaptive meaning benefit and introgression meaning exchange of genes. And there's also a very classic example of this now from two mosquito species that live in Africa. So this is a very recent event that's happened. Around the year 2000, these two species, that live in Africa, one of them evolved insecticide resistance. So this is a species that causes malaria, so loads of insecticide is used to try to control it. And some individuals of this one species were found to be resistant to this insecticide, which is based on DDT, that is used to control it. 5 years later, in West Africa, all the individuals of the first species had this insecticide resistance gene. So it had rapidly spread through the population because of the benefit it provides. But the really interesting thing that happened is that these species then interbred, and the insecticide resistance gene was transferred to an individual from the second species. And now, in West Africa, the second species is completely insecticide resistant as well. So here we have two species that stayed completely distinct, but managed to exchange a gene that was beneficial to both of them. And in this case, it's a real problem because they're now can no longer be controlled by insecticides. But it's also kind of an interesting, exciting idea almost that the species is not just existing on its own. It might benefit by getting genes from elsewhere in its environment, and that actually could help it to respond to changes like insecticide or to climate change. changes are coming. I think that's all I had to say. So if you have any questions,